am pleased to introduce, coming to us from the great state of Hawaii, HillVets lead protege, Cindy Serrano Roberts.
Aloha and good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today for a fantastic panel discussion on refocusing the United States' defense. So we are so thrilled to have Mr. Jimmy Santos joining us today. So Jimmy's worked in all public service sort of levels, local, state, and federal. He advises elected officials on veterans issues, national security, and domestic policy. Additionally, he served on active duty with the Department of the Air Force as a lead tactics instructor, flying over 180 combat missions in Afghanistan. And he was named top 40 under 40 veterans in 2014. He currently serves as an intelligence officer in the Massachusetts National Guard. Furthermore, Jimmy is a political partner with the Truman National Security Project. He's a leader within Veterans for American Ideals and a member of Foreign Policy for America's Next Generation Initiative. He's also the National Security Project's Boston chapter co-lead, and he's a huge part of the community in the greater Boston area. We are so happy to have him today and sort of get a look through his lens on how he supports national security. Welcome, Jimmy.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I'm glad to be here.
Our next panelist is Lieutenant Colonel Palmer Roberts. He also hails from the great state of Hawaii. Palmer is currently assigned as Deputy Chief of INDOPACOM, Joint Integrated Space Team at Camp Smith. He's responsible for providing a full scope of space planning and support to the Combat Command. He leads security cooperation for space with 22 partner countries, and his efforts directly enable senior leaders to make critical decisions affecting the tactical, operational, and the strategic levels of warfare. Palmer, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today.
All right, so let's just jump on in. So today's panel discussion will be focused on refocusing defense and strengthening and sustaining the United States' deterrence at home and abroad. So I'd like to open up with this question. How do you think the United States' foreign policy addresses and deconflicts partisan priorities? And can it be separated from international politics?
So in terms of the partisan divide, which is certainly something that we can't ignore for the past couple of years here in the United States, the key thing to identify is that the partisan politics is really highlighted and put center stage at the national level of politics. So we're looking at folks on the Hill, along with that, whatever dynamic exists between the legislative branch and the executive branch of government. But not to quote, a research organization separate from our fantastic host here, but they've done studies on the actual view of foreign policy amongst Democratic and Republican constituents. And when you look at the research that comes out, it actually shows that Democratic and Republican voters don't have much of a distinction between where they stand on different foreign policy initiatives and things on international affairs. When you look at the different line items, they're pretty much in lockstep on everything, with the minor exception of things that actually affect them directly. So we're looking at issues of immigration, looking at issues of trade. And so it's more the domestic side of foreign policy where we see a partisan divide amongst the constituents. In terms of the elected officials, that you see, for lack of a better term, the grandstanding that you'll see on Capitol Hill, the interrogation of political appointees, asking them to defend the presidential administration, the policy that they put in place. But a key thing, as those of us that work in community service and public service should know, is that our constituents themselves don't really differ too much on our engagement overseas. In terms of the second part of that question, in terms of international politics, our allies and even our adversaries are not necessarily ignorant to the fact that we can change our president every 4 years. The swings in our approach to different strategies will switch between the different political parties that they're affiliated with. But over the past couple of years, the extremist approach to our partisan divides, the polarization of our partisan divide has certainly impacted the way that we conduct diplomacy overseas. It has affected our relationship and even our military partnerships, our military security pacts, which is supposed to be more consistent or more mainstream. So what's been going on the past couple of years has been a lot more adversarial in terms of our relationship with our partners and allies, because they view our lack of continuity amongst our personal views as an American identity And so that becomes difficult in terms of rebuilding that trust.
I especially like how you touched on this sort of bipolar effect that we've been experiencing in our domestic landscape over the last several years. And you're absolutely right. That is certainly something that our adversaries can sort of exploit and capitalize on.
And so I'd offer, from my perspective, working at a military combatant command, where I've seen some effects. For the second part of that question is just consistency. So what we base our work and what we're trying to do out here on is the relationship, and that relationship is based on consistent engagement and a consistent message, and that has been difficult with the polarization that Jimmy described.
So as we go down that road and we kind of talk about our adversaries, China is undoubtedly improving their Navy and enhancing their military. But how can the United States leverage its comparative advantage in governance, economics, and the mining of rare earth minerals, energy production, and some of these other resources?
So speaking more in terms of how it affects us locally will be more of an approach on the economic front as opposed to the military front, which I'm sure Parma will talk to in just a moment. But when we look at China's strategy, one of the greatest things that's of concern to most people, most constituents, will be the economic approach that they're taking with their Belt and Road Initiative. And so what we can see through that is that China is not only taking a military approach to their engagement overseas, they're taking an economic approach, they're taking a development approach. So from an economic standpoint, we know that domestically, at least under the Obama administration, that on an annual basis, we would have over $20 billion in exports in grain, soy, pork, and beef products from U.S. agricultural industry, U.S. farmers that were exporting overseas. And as we started to get involved with a larger trade deficit, escalating to a trade war under the Trump administration, what ended up happening following Trump's tariffs and engagement against China and the trade pact was that we went down from $20 billion in trade on an annual basis, or $20 billion in export, down to $9 billion in export. And so when we have our farmers, our domestic population losing half of their income, generally speaking, simply based off a trade relationship or a adversarial diplomatic relationship with a potential partner, that's one of the best ways that we can educate our citizenry on what's actually at stake when we engage in foreign policy. And so that's kind of the thing that we need to talk about with China's aggression, China's influence, China's hegemony within not just their part of the world, but their approach to the global south as a whole. We need to focus on how does that impact our local citizens. That way we can get their buy-in into our strategy, not just militarily, but diplomatically.
And I don't think you can separate any of that from public opinion here, stateside, and how that shapes public support for the administration. Absolutely.
Yes, excellent comments, Jimmy. In line with what you said, I would say the United States is engaged in an international struggle between competing visions. So it's very difficult to look at this just from the military lens. What we've been challenged to do is to work with some of our interagency partners, Department of State and others, to look at it from a whole of government lens, because we are competing very much so in that economic arena. And even the activities that we do in theater, a lot of times we are not, although we have a lot of the resources and the personnel and some of the expertise, we're not going to be the lead because we are actually competing against two actual systems, if you will.
And I think what we're starting to see here as we kind of unpack this is the soft power that China can arguably effectively deploy in order to shape global engagement and even the public opinion of their citizens, which leads me to the next question. So what role do you think politicians have at the federal and local levels in educating their constituents and explaining the trade-offs associated with this great power competition? So, for example, higher prices for your everyday commodities right now. We're starting to see gas prices starting to come down a little bit, but we're certainly experiencing a bit of inflation here.
Engagement with China or engagement with our allies and our adversaries, we need to focus on what is the true impact to our constituents. We need to explain to them how is that going to affect them, like you said, at the gas pump, how's it going to affect them in their daily life. And so one of the biggest gripes that we'll see when we do polling and research amongst constituents to see what is their opinion on foreign policies, that they think it's not worth it. We need to take more of an isolation approach. We need to take more of a, let's focus on domestic policy first. But because of the globalized world in which we live, because of the interaction and engagement that we've had over the past century of American influence, we cannot separate and isolate ourselves, as we were saying earlier. So as part of our education awareness campaign, I think one of the greatest things that we can talk about in the foreign policy arena is actually highlighting the work that our local and state governments do as it relates to foreign policy, because that is where we see the most immediate and most direct impact between public officials and the constituents, is at the local level. When we look at the national level, it takes years with the legislation and lobbying. It takes language writing within that legislation. It takes convincing different interest groups that have the lawyers and the advocates that can focus on those issues. When it comes down to the actual voter themselves, they may not be as interested or aware in terms of how that affects them directly. So when it comes to local and regional governments, one thing that we can do is we can look at the demographic makeup of a community. I come from Boston, where over half of our citizens are first-generation Americans. We have a large diaspora community of individuals from Portugal and Cape Verde. So in terms of what we can do with them is we can actually say, we have a large portion of our population that can actually reach out to their families in Cape Verde and see what can we do to engage in an international partnership. So when we actually look at the makeup of our public safety force, we see that a great proportion of them actually are Portuguese descendants and Cape Verdean descendants. So we actually engage in a public safety training with Cape Verde, where we can actually take individuals from the islands, bring them to Boston, train them in our facilities, provide them with public safety equipment, and return that favor. And so we're actually able to show a connection not only between generations that stay in Boston, but individuals that, other members of their family that stay back home in their home country, to show that there is a benefit there in terms of what we can do as a city to help that population. Is that we're not just looking at you as a vote, we're not just looking at you as a citizen, we're looking at every aspect of you and your culture and your identity. So we look at different ways that local governments can engage, and city and state diplomacy is going to be a big thing, whether it be through cultural diplomacy, sports diplomacy. LA just hosted the Summit of the Americas. They could be hosting the Olympics and Paralympics. There is no way that any city can simply focus on domestic issues without identifying immigration impacts, economic impacts, foreign influence, whether it be positive or negative. And so it needs to be identified between what relationship that city can have with foreign partners, whether they be neighbors or distant lands. And I think that's one of the great things about our country, is that we can actually highlight the work of people down on the ground and not just those in the presidential administration.
So I would say, from the military perspective, the need to educate at all different levels is absolutely imperative. As we've hit on before, the PRC's ability to use coercion, pressure, and disinformation, it's all aimed at destabilizing the rules-based system of which the United States and other powers are a part of. And so I'd say it's one of the more, kind of dangerous times, since Mao, in terms of their willingness to kind of use expansionism and force to kind of resolve some of their territorial issues. And so our actual public at all different levels have to be educated about what that threat is, about what their part is. And these constituents are the ones that we've got to recruit and retain, not just in the defense sector, but throughout our economy, to basically compete with China at all the different levels. And so it's absolutely important that you're able to have that dialogue and that inclusiveness at all different levels.
This is such a great discussion, and it touches on how we leverage our country's diversity, not just nationally, but also locally, in order to strengthen and support our national defense. And along those lines, I actually have a question for Palmer. So Palmer, space is kind of this new thing, right, for a lot of us, but it's been around for several decades, the great, race to space. So now that space is starting to get infused more into this great power competition, what do you think is important to understand about space? And what do you think is sort of should be captured in space policy as we move forward and we start to see space being utilized in the great power competition?
I would say, first off, space is inextricably linked to our United States way of life. And it is linked to a lot of our partners' way of life, and that's only increasing. And so when you're thinking just, getting gas at the pump, banking transactions, farming, as Jimmy mentioned before, navigation, whether it be on land, air, all of those things are currently enhanced by space operations, and we depend on those things day to day. So our way of life depends on space operations, and so that doesn't mean everyone has to be an expert, but it just means that our leadership and our country has a job to do as far as educating everyone on that. In line with that, you talked about, doing things at all the different levels. The Air Force and now the Space Force embarked probably about 5 or 6 years ago on a campaign, if you will, to, I'll show you this right here. This is a little pamphlet here that the then Secretary of the Air Force put out to communicate with partners at the unclassified level, with Congress, and with pretty much the general public to say, hey, there's actually, a threat from China and others. Hey, this is very important to our way of life. And just to actually get that information out there instead of doing what we had done historically, which was trust us, there's something out there, we've got it. So that openness, and again, that inclusivity is what we need to kind of move forward.
What, in your opinion, what do you think should be captured in space policy to support this great power competition?
Probably the most important thing, in my opinion, and the work I've done is we have to fundamentally overhaul our space policy so that we share with others and we have the proper legislation and policy to actually work with partners. Because the way it's structured right now is to not share and to not work together. And we do not have the resources, whether it be personnel, money, or actual material things, to go it alone. And that's not our guidance per our national leadership and national strategy.
Jimmy, I have a question specifically for you. You touched on a lot of ways that Boston is leveraging its citizenship and kind of getting them involved in order to support policy, foreign and domestic. So in your opinion, why should the everyday Joe or Jill care about this great power competition, especially if he or she is not tied to the defense sector?
Well, I think Palmer just did a great job in explaining that, because whereas I'm trying to approach things from an international relations perspective for our city and local government perspective, he just mentioned that it's now interstellar, it's intergalactic, right? GPS, everybody has GPS in their phone. Everyone wants to use GPS to go where get where they're going. Just during the COVID pandemic, we saw issues with supply chain and routing. That's, navigation is extremely important. As we're trying to normalize, trying to get back on planes, be able to fly where we want to go, enjoy our freedoms, enjoy vacation times, it's really important to actually get the buy-in from the individuals themselves. And so at the local level, there is no escape from public opinion, because, as I said earlier, the direct impact that a city mayor or a county commissioner has, they can make a decision, and then overnight that can change the way that their city interacts with their constituency. Federal government's going to take a little bit more time. So there's nothing preventing citizens from having that direct line of access with their local elected officials. I myself have been stopped as I was going into the grocery store or going out on a run by people that saw me make a policy that they agreed with, or most of the time that they didn't agree with. So getting that buy-in from them, educating them, informing them is really important. You have to bring it in such a way that you basically have to go on a listening tour. You have to understand what it is that their concern is. If they are echoing or mirroring concerns that they heard on radio or television and they're not really sure how that impacts them, you could explain it to them. If they're focused more on education and making sure that their kids are safe in schools, whether it be due to the increase in gun violence or because of the extreme spread of the pandemic, you have to explain what you're doing at the local level to make sure that their kids are safe. When it comes to the supply chain issues, you want to make sure that they understand that there's going to be baby formula on the shelf. So you always have to engage with them in such a way that they understand, especially when it comes to the issues that are important to them, so that you can then better inform yourself on how to better make policy. Because one thing that I believe lacks in federal policymaking is stakeholder engagement. And so a lot of people who may have great intentions may come up with policies that to them appear well-intentioned and appear that it's going to provide a great benefit and a great program to their constituency, but without actually talking to the constituency who actually has all the different caveats and contingencies, that has the forecast on how that's going to impact them. If you're not aware of that actual impact, then that policy pretty much falls on its face. And so the listening towards the engagement with the constituents isn't just to educate them, it's to educate yourself as a public official.
Thank you so much for kind of tying all of that together. So we have time for one last question. So with any institutional change, you need to ready your workforce, and many are looking to talent management as a way to accomplish this, right? So what does talent management mean to you? And what are some common areas that we see organizations apply this concept that maybe aren't working so great?
Okay, so I'm going to address it, but I'll put a little more of a positive spin on it. So looking at the military as a whole, they've done an overhaul on how we do recruiting, how we do retention, and just because there's a realization that people have options, and the folks that we are getting into the military are quite educated, and there's a generational difference as well, where people are used to, almost expected to have multiple different careers. And so highlighting that is the 20-year retirement that is well known throughout the military, that is no more. So I would say the military is trying to, in some aspects, mirror the corporate world and start to actually entice people with bonuses, with increased maternity leave, with all sorts of different benefits, and not rely on just the patriotism, if you will, or hey, you signed a contract, I've got you. But so I've seen a positive trend towards actually trying to do talent management versus just relying on the hold you have over the military forces.
Jimmy, I'd like to turn to you at this point. If you have one thought that you would like to leave us with in regards of refocusing defense, what would that be?
I believe it's kind of what I was talking about. My last response was both it's the engagement with the stakeholders, it's engagement with the constituents. It's educating the public on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how it's going to benefit them in the long run, and then getting that feedback and engaging in that stakeholder relationship to provide that buy-in to the constituency, to allow them to know that, should they run for office, should they get engaged with the defense sector, the foreign policy sector, that they actually have some experience or some know-how on what's going on and what those breakdowns in communication are, what was the failures, what were the successes, and then how to apply that going forward. So engaging in that intergenerational conversation, engaging that feedback loop, I think will be the most beneficial thing that we can do as public servants.
I'd say I'd leave you with the thought that it is a whole of government effort. So it takes all of the people in the United States, all constituents, and a general awareness, knowledge, and education to understand. And as Jimmy said earlier, that buy-in, if you will, goes a long way. We don't have an authoritarian system, and so even military and defense activities are reliant on civilian control and the influence that we have. And so, even though it may not seem like it, everyone has, influence and input into that process.
I think that's a great note to sort of stop here. Everybody has influence. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your service to our country. Thank you for your support and sharing your thoughts on refocusing defense here at CAPCON. We loved having this conversation. And so aloha and mahalo from Hawaii. Thank you.